Good evening, everybody. We will be getting started in just a few moments, just waiting for a few more people to arrive. Good evening again, and we're now going to get started on the Fossil Fuel-Free Building Demonstration Program webinar that the Community Development Department and other city departments have organized for this evening, and again on July the 24th. Let me start by going to the next slide to introduce who is in attendance from the city this evening. My name is Suzanne Rasmussen. I'm Director of the Environmental and Transportation Planning Division in the Community Development Department. Also here is Nikhil Nedkarni, an Energy Project Planner, Jennifer Ballou, Sustainability Project Planner, and Brad Pillen, Energy Engagement Planner, all in the Community Development Department. And let me start by noting that this meeting is being recorded so that we may translate it offline after the meeting for people who can access it in different languages. Next slide, please. A quick overview of how you can participate this evening. This meeting is held in a webinar format, so the way you can engage is by asking questions through the question and answer feature in the webinar. If you have any technical issues, please send an email to jballou@cambridgema.gov. You can see that at the bottom right-hand side of this slide. The way you are joining the meeting is with your video and microphone off, and that will stay off for the entirety of the meeting. You can type your written questions or comments in the Zoom Q&A panel. You can find that at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It looks like you can see here on the slide, it says Q&A, and you can post your question there, and we will either, if it's an easy question, answer it in writing as we go along in the webinar, or we will read out the questions at the end of this meeting and provide answers in person. Next slide, please. The agenda for this evening has several elements. First, a section on the background for the fossil fuel-free demonstration program, how it fits into Cambridge's actions to address climate change overall. Then we'll describe the new regulation that is called the Massachusetts Fossil Fuel-Free Demonstration Program, and give an overview of the proposed requirements that are part of this program. It is focused on eliminating the use of fossil fuels in new buildings and also in new renovations. And we will give you an overview of the timeline and next steps for the city to adopt this new regulation and the opportunities that exist for shaping the regulation with your input. And then finally, as noted, we will have a question and answer session and try to answer as many questions that you may have. Next slide, please. So first, a little bit about the background of Cambridge addressing climate change. Next slide, please. So the city has, for a very long time, been committed to taking action on climate change. And we work on climate change in two different ways. One, to bring our greenhouse gas emissions to zero by the year 2050, which is what this meeting will address, and also to prepare for the inevitable impacts we will be experiencing from climate change. And Cambridge is doing this as part of a larger coalition of cities in the Boston area that all have committed to meeting the target for eliminating greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. Next slide, please. In Cambridge, buildings produce the most greenhouse gas emissions. As you can see on the pie chart, buildings are more than 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced in Cambridge, and transportation represents 10%, and waste only 7%. The building greenhouse gas emissions come from the use of fossil fuel on site in your building, and that is represented by either using gas, oil, or potentially other forms of fossil fuel, and from electricity use. Electricity in our state is getting cleaner each year, and utility companies are required to deliver an increasing amount of clean electricity every year. And it is expected that the grid that delivers electricity will be mostly renewable as soon as 2030. Next slide, please. Cambridge has developed a long-range plan. We call it the Net Zero Action Plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. And that plan was first adopted in 2015 and was recently updated through a process that involved many community stakeholders, the city council, and others, just in late 2021, so very recently. That plan identifies all of the policies and programs that are being recommended to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions and allow us to get to no emissions from buildings by the year 2050. Next slide, please. The Net Zero Action Plan, as I said, has a range of different actions, and it is focused on emissions both from existing and new buildings. And this evening's conversation will primarily focus on new buildings or buildings that are being very substantially renovated. And as you can see here, this is an overview slide from the Net Zero Action Plan. Some of the elements in the plan are requirements, and some have to do with the types of incentives and support that will be provided for building owners to be able to meet these targets. And some things come from what is happening with the energy supply, such as the electricity grid. Next slide, please. Specifically, the Action 2.1 in the Net Zero Action Plan calls for new buildings to be net zero from the start, including actions to have Cambridge advocate to the state to develop net zero building codes, since the state of Massachusetts, not Cambridge, sets the building codes, and to adopt such a code as soon as the state makes it possible, and eliminate pathways for fossil fuel use in new construction, because it's the best opportunity for fully electrifying a building if it happens from the beginning. And of course, to monitor the outcomes of putting in place these requirements. Next slide, please. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Nikhil Nakarni, who is going to start describing for you the circumstances by which the fossil fuel demonstration came about and what the specific elements of it is. Over to you, Nikhil.
Thanks, Suzanne. So, similar to the work we've been doing in Cambridge on identifying how we can get to net zero, Massachusetts has also identified policies and programs to get to net zero by 2050. It's called the 2050 Decarbonization Roadmap. And two elements that are of note in the building section of the decarbonization roadmap are that new construction offers the easiest and most economically attractive way to start decarbonizing the building sector, and that almost all new buildings can cost effectively pursue an efficient electric design. So that's a fossil fuel free design that increases occupant comfort and also pays for itself. So as one element of supporting high performance buildings in Massachusetts, the state created last year the specialized stretch code, which you might have heard of. And the specialized stretch code sets a very high performance standard for new buildings, very high energy efficiency requirements, but it still was designed in a way that permitted buildings to use fossil fuels. And nonetheless, Cambridge adopted the specialized stretch code in January 2023 by a vote of City Council. So meeting our targets, our climate targets, means phasing out fossil fuels in new construction. So what this would mean is that new buildings are built without fossil fuel systems. So buildings are built without gas furnaces or gas-fired water heaters, and that applies to gas, oil, and other fossil fuel uses that would happen inside the building. Several other cities and states in the US, you may have read about these, several other cities and states that have climate commitments similar to Cambridge or similar to Massachusetts have passed no new gas requirements for new buildings. So, there's the article on DC. New York City first enacted a no new gas policy, and then New York State did as a whole. San Jose, San Francisco, other cities in the Bay Area, and then effectively much of California has a no new gas policy. So instead, builders are required to install clean all-electric systems. So fossil fuel free means that new buildings will be built using systems like heat pumps for heating, heat pump water heaters to provide hot water for sinks and showers. The clean air benefits for the air in general are documented, but there are also many scientific studies identifying the benefits to indoor air quality as well. So this also prevents developers of new buildings from installing new gas infrastructure that would have to be removed later on in advance of meeting our climate goals to be net zero in 2050. So next, I will move to the section on the Massachusetts Fossil Fuel Free Demonstration Program. So the Massachusetts legislature has authorized 10 communities in Massachusetts to implement fossil fuel free requirements for new construction and major renovation. So this is part of a larger climate bill that was enacted in 2022. So this state-created demonstration program is being led by the Department of Energy Resources, and they've developed regulations for the program, as well as a suggested ordinance, or what's referred to as a model rule. So Cambridge provided input to DOER, the Department of Energy Resources, in developing the regulations this winter. And then final regulations were sent to the legislature in May, effectively creating a final set of regulations as well as a final suggested ordinance for the 10 communities. So Cambridge has been selected to be able to participate in the Massachusetts demonstration program as one of those 10 communities. So Cambridge submitted a home rule petition by a vote of City Council voted upon in December 2021 and submitted to the state in April 2022. So that makes us a prioritized community eligible to participate in this program. A city or town must also meet the 10% affordable housing requirement or meet the MBTA communities zoning requirement. And so Cambridge would qualify as 10% of our housing stock is restricted as affordable. Over 10%, I should say. And I should note that if a prioritized community drops out or is unable to meet the housing requirements, DOER is likely to select a substitute community. And just for context, both Somerville and Boston are expected to pursue participation as a substitute community. The other 10 you can see on the right side: Arlington, Lexington, Brookline, Acton, Concord, Lincoln, Newton, West Tisbury, and Aquinnah. And 6 of those, as of today, as you know, from what we've learned, have already voted in their town meetings or select boards to move the fossil fuel-free requirements forward and to adopt them. So the next item in our agenda is to actually understand what fossil fuel-free requirements mean for new buildings and for major renovations. So the demonstration program requires new buildings and major renovations to be fossil fuel-free. So again, new buildings are covered by fossil fuel-free, and then major renovations are covered and defined in the state regulation. That's commonly understood as 50% or more of a building's floor area, so a fairly substantial renovation of a structure. There in the sidebar there's a little bit more information that summarizes the sort of detailed code-based definitions of major renovations. So again, 50% of a building, or if you're adding in a way that doubles a building's footprint, or adds 1,000 square feet to a single or 2 family house, or 20,000 square feet to a non-residential building. It is important to note that the state regulation that the legislature passed exempted hospitals, medical offices, and laboratories. So those buildings will not be affected by fossil fuel free and cannot be affected by Cambridge's adoption of the fossil fuel free demonstration program. So as I mentioned before, the demonstration program has a suggested ordinance, or as referred to as model rule. And so what that covers is that a building cannot use coal, oil, natural gas, or other fossil fuels in its operation. So this would generally be understood to include things like heating, hot water systems, lighting, cooking, clothes drying, and potentially commercial process loads. So restaurants, dry cleaners, manufacturing. A city or town may propose limited exemptions or changes to the model ordinance with justification. So while DOER has established a model ordinance as suggested language, it is language that the city would have to justify if we chose to make any minor amendments to that. And the model ordinance is based on the specialized building code that I mentioned a few slides ago. And it basically would be structured in a way that the mixed fuel pathways that use fossil fuels in the code, those pathways are eliminated, and the all electric pathway in the code is the means of complying with the building code going forward. There are 2 clarifications that DOER has included in the model rule to allow gas or propane use for multifamily water heating until 2027, after which point the multifamily buildings would have to be all electric, including in water heating. And then it spells out that major renovations, again, the sort of large-scale renovations, can install new fossil fuel equipment for heating, hot water, and cooking. And the emphasis there is on the installation of new equipment being prohibited. And then finally, I'll note that the state will be conducting an evaluation of outcomes. So the City of Cambridge already posts our building permit information on open data. We'll be actively providing that to DOER upon adoption of fossil fuel free. And then DOER will also access energy use in a secure way from the utilities so as to evaluate the emissions impacts of going fossil fuel free. And so the next item in our agenda is a timeline of the program structure at the state level, and next steps for adopting regulation here in Cambridge. So per state regulation, Cambridge must submit its final application, including the proposed ordinance and the date effective to DOER by September 1st of this year. So that's a little bit under 8 weeks from now. Failure to do so by that date would result in elimination from the program. And municipalities can submit their applications earlier to DOER for feedback. And again, 6 other communities have already moved forward with that process. So we're sharing information about the program with Cambridge residents and building owners. So there's information at this webinar. As Suzanne mentioned, there's going to be a second session with similar content, but the same presentation effectively on July 24th for folks who can't make it today. We are engaging with building professionals, folks working on new buildings, designers working on major renovations at this week's specialized code webinars. So tomorrow at 4 p.m. there's a specialized code for commercial building presentation that we're collaborating with Mass Save on. And then on Wednesday at the same time, there's the residential specialized code presentation, also in collaboration with Mass Save. We've been flyering at community spaces throughout Cambridge. There have been news items and online information, outreach to resident associations and business associations, as well as information to large building owners and building professionals. Again, the architects, the designers, builders who are involved with new buildings and major renovations. The folks working on that in Cambridge. So we want your feedback on how new buildings in Cambridge and those major renovations could be fossil fuel free. So in addition to getting feedback and doing some Q&A today, we've created an online survey to gather input from residents and building owners. And that survey covers specific types of buildings that we should focus our research on, specific uses or building systems. So, things like a specific type of heating system or a specific process load that we should further research. It covers how major renovations could be fossil fuel free and other topics that we should research. Survey responses are due by July 17th to be incorporated into our research. And the URL for that, there's the short URL. It's bit.ly and FFF updates. That'll take you to the fossil fuel free webpage that you may have seen already, and the surveys right near the top of that page. So the next steps for Cambridge are the CDD, the Community Development Department, is working with a research consultant to explore if any changes to the model rule are appropriate. And again, those would need to be justified. And we're doing that by examining the types of buildings that are being built or renovated in Cambridge. We're understanding any technical limitations to all electric equipment, if any should exist for specific building types or end uses. We're reviewing how the process loads in Cambridge that exist could be affected in a newly built building or in a major renovation. And we're reviewing input received from that survey to include in the research. So the City Council will then discuss the proposed ordinance language at the August 1st Ordinance Committee meeting, and we'll vote on final language on August 7th. So that concludes the content of our presentation. I'll turn it back over to Suzanne to get us started on the question and answer section of the evening.
Thank you, Nikhil. And I would just add 2 quick things. One, Nikhil a couple of times mentioned the term process load. And just so everybody understands what that means, that is use of energy that in a building that is not covered by the building code. So sort of an easy example of that is your television, or in a commercial building, it could be equipment used to manufacture Tootsie Rolls, one of the things we do in Cambridge. So that's just something that we're required to address in this. And also I would note that we are working off of the model ordinance that Nikhil described, and we'll be using that to make any proposals for modifications. So that's sort of the basis that we're starting with. And with that, our presentation is complete, and we're going to switch into the question and answer part of the meeting. And just to repeat, your video and microphones will stay off, but you can type written questions or comments in the Zoom Q&A panel. It's at the bottom of your screen, and looks like the black box with the little thought bubbles, and you can use that. And we have a number of questions and comments that are coming in, so we'll just start from one end and start addressing them. And I think we might just go in order right now, and then we'll see if we need to start sort of if there are questions that come in that address answers that we've already given, they will show up in, we will give a written response to that. So the first question we received was, how will major renovations for campus buildings that are connected to central utility plants or fossil fuel based district energy? So you have one power plant and you have a bunch of buildings connected to it. And that is one of the things that we're looking at. The model ordinance does not address this, and we're going to be looking at that as part of our technical research and come up with a proposal for how that might be handled. So that's something that will definitely be discussed at the August 1st meeting of the City Council Ordinance Committee. The second question is, with respect to condominiums or individual apartments, if an individual owner has major work undertaken, does that kick in the ordinance, or is it only if 50% of the whole building? And it notes that a lot of people don't understand this. So Nikhil, maybe I can ask you to speak to that.
Sure. The definition of major renovation is really based in the building code, and it refers to what's called a level 3 renovation. And the level 3 renovation, it refers to 50% of a building's floor area being renovated. So it is defined at the building level, not at the unit level. So 50% of a building would need to be undergoing a renovation in order to qualify as a major renovation.
Thank you, Nikhil. We have a comment about how to avoid that buildings that are being renovated would result in costs being passed on to tenants. And in the comment, there's an example given of how a building was renovated and costs were passed along to tenants. So there isn't a part of this ordinance currently that creates a prohibition against building owners that are renovating their buildings to pass along those costs. And of course, that is not the case with any building renovation right now. So that is something that would need to be discussed separately, but that is not something that's in place as part of any of these requirements. We have a question: when a natural gas-fired hot water heater fails in a multifamily building after 2027, can they replace like with like, or do they need to make it all electric? And I'll turn that over to you, Nikhil.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the way the fossil fuel-free demonstration program is set up is that it applies to the method of construction when a building is newly constructed, or again, the renovation when a building undergoes a major renovation. It doesn't have sort of requirements for that building in operation later on, or sort of individual equipment. So really, so to this question, so if that gas-fired water heater were to fail in a multifamily building, this program doesn't really affect the installation of individual equipment, right? So that multifamily building could install another gas-fired water heater, an oil-fired water heater for that matter. It's really only applicable to new construction and to a major renovation of a building.
Thank you. The next question is, how does Cambridge intend to monitor a property's proportional use of renewable electricity? And this program does not address the type of electricity or the proportion that is renewable, specifically related to this ordinance. I would say in general, because the city buys electricity on behalf of the vast majority of both residents and small businesses and a portion of large businesses in Cambridge, we directly control how much renewable electricity is being consumed in Cambridge through what is being provided through, and it's called the Cambridge Community Electricity, or the aggregation. So we have a good sense of both being able to supply as much renewable electricity as possible, and also understanding how much is being used. And the program offering is changing starting in January. So the new version of the aggregation will roll in early January, and we are expecting that to have significantly more renewable electricity than is currently the case. So it's a unique situation in cities such as Cambridge that have a electricity buying arrangement on behalf of consumers, that we have a direct understanding of how much is being used. In addition, under the Building Energy Use Disclosure Ordinance, the amendments that were just adopted for large buildings, we will also have an understanding of the largest buildings and their use of renewable electricity starting in 2026. Okay, next question. Given that there is only one city council meeting between now and September 1st, on August 7, how can we ensure that the application to be in the fossil fuel demonstration program will be approved and submitted by the September 1st deadline? So the short answer to that is that by the city council voting to participate, and that's obviously the prerogative of the council. The council is very aware of these deadlines, and we didn't note this early on, but the deadline is short and was changed by the state. We had expected this to be November 1st, and then in just a few weeks ago, it was changed to September 1st. So that's why we're on this very compressed timeline. But there is we submitted a lot of information to the council 2 weeks ago. The ordinance has been moved to a second reading, which means that it is available to be voted on August 7th. And as noted, there is an ordinance committee meeting, which is a committee of the whole, meaning all councilors are members of the ordinance committee. And that takes place on August 1st. Okay, next question. When does this take effect, and when will residential contractors need to comply? I'll turn that over to you, Nikhil.
Part of our application process to DOER is to specify when fossil fuel free would go into effect in Cambridge. Among the 6 other communities that have passed, I believe a lot of them have structured it so that goes into effect about 3 months after DOER approves their proposed language. So as part of our application process and as part of City Council's consideration of the measure, we will be developing the date effective.
Thank you. Next question is, are you going to change the heating system in Cambridge Housing Authority too? So again, this ordinance will affect buildings that are being constructed new, so entirely new buildings, or buildings that are undergoing major renovation. And in general, for buildings such as Cambridge Housing Authority buildings that tend to be very large, it would be only if over 50% of the building were going to be renovated. Okay, next question. Are there advantages to being named a prioritized community? And with this increased demand, will Eversource be able to provide us with the electricity we'll need by 2030? So the first question, yes, there is a major advantage to being named a prioritized community. Only prioritized communities will be allowed to participate in the demonstration. So as Nikhil mentioned, 10 have been already identified, and only if one or more of those are unable to or unwilling to participate can other communities become part of the demonstration. So we were named prioritized as a result of the action that was taken by the council in late 21 and by the legislature in early 22 to create this option for communities to require fossil fuel free new construction, which is normally something that is done through the building code, which only the state controls. So to be able to do this, you have to be a prioritized community, or you have to become prioritized because one of the initial 10 communities dropped out. The second question, with this increased demand, will we have enough electricity for in 2030? So we have had very extensive conversations with Eversource, and the City Council has had extensive conversations, primarily because of the changes to the Building Energy Use Disclosure Ordinance, which only affects existing buildings, which use the vast majority of the energy because there are so many more existing buildings than new buildings. So we expect that Eversource will take the necessary steps to meet the demand that results from more buildings electrifying in Cambridge, and they are well aware, and they have built this expectations about greater use of electricity into buildings in Cambridge into their projections for what they need for electricity infrastructure going forward. It is something that in the Bureau amendments is noted that the requirements will only take effect if Eversource is able to supply the necessary electricity. So that is one of the things that could be discussed as part of this as well. Okay. Will the final ordinance include the exemption for large multifamily buildings until January 1st, 2027? It was missing from the draft presented at City Council. I'll turn that over to you, Nikhil.
Yeah, we can take a look at the draft presented at City Council. I think I should clarify that the exemption in the model rule that has been suggested by DOER is specific to water heating in multifamily buildings. So a large multifamily building would have to have, would have to be built with all electric equipment otherwise, including for heating. It's just the water heating part. There's DOAR has suggested that could be for, until the end of 2026, be built with a fossil fuel based system. But again, if we choose not, we would have to justify any deviations from the model rule, including not including that exception.
Thank you. Next question. A lot of energy may be used for exhaust and makeup air systems in a commercial kitchen. Do the requirements for commercial kitchen exhaust hoods allow for reduced CFM, so cubic feet per minute, so the amount of air that is being replaced for electric or induction appliances versus gas-fired appliances? So I'm not entirely sure how to answer this question. Nikhil, do you have a
I can add some preliminary thoughts. I think what the question asker is referring to is that induction cooking actually creates a lot less heat in the room, right? So in commercial kitchens, oftentimes the temperature for kitchen workers is really hot because the heat is coming out of the stove, and for induction cooking, there's a lot less of that. And so the question is, would the code be adapted? Would the code sort of allow for less ventilation equipment or less powerful ventilation equipment? I think that's a great question that we will pose to our research consultants working on this, so that we can account for that in our development of the language.
Thank you, Nikhil. Next question. How are you evaluating capacity of Eversource to carry new electric loads that will result from new requirements? I think I addressed this question, but I just add the additional thought that Eversource has started doing a fairly complex load forecasting, meaning understanding how much electricity they need going forward. And as I noted, this is based on the actual regulations that are being proposed and an understanding of what is likely to be built in Cambridge or renovated. So I think their ability to predict, and I would say that they always plan for worst case scenario, they have really improved their capabilities and their integration of the specific requirements that are being passed in Cambridge. Okay, next question. Would Cambridge consider allowing PACE financing for renovations under this plan? And I'll just pause for a moment and explain to everyone here what this means. So in Massachusetts, there's a quasi-state agency called Mass Development, and that agency makes available what's called property assessed clean energy financing. That's what PACE stands for. And what that does is that they make available funds that people can loan funds that people can access, and the loan is structured through your tax bill, your property tax bill in Cambridge. So if you take out a PACE loan, you will be paying back you're making your loan payments through the city's tax bill. And the advantage of that is that a property owner can have a loan that travels with the building. So when the building is sold, it'll just continue, the loan payments can continue be on your tax bill. And that makes it more lucrative, if you will, to have loans that may have a longer payback, even if you're deciding that you might want to sell your building earlier. So the many communities in Massachusetts have already adopted the ability to take for a property owner to access PACE funding, and it is expected that the city council will actually also vote to adopt PACE funding in Cambridge at the August 7 meeting. So if someone wants to access a PACE loan to do a new building or a major building renovation, that is entirely possible. And we think this is a positive new addition to property owners' ability to finance either new construction or renovation. Okay, we have heard that Cambridge is about maxed out with what it can electrify given the existing electric capacity. Shouldn't we wait to pass such a mandate until we have a study of electric capacity available for expansion and projected need for electrification in the near term? I think I have provided an answer to this, and certainly there's no short-term concern, and we're Eversource has been very involved, as I've noted, in both understanding and predicting their ability to serve our needs for electrification. It will take new infrastructure to be built, electricity infrastructure to be built in Cambridge over time, but that is part of Eversource's strategy for being able to meet the new loads that are required through electrification. There's a question, why can hospital, medical office, and laboratories have exception to the requirement? Nikhil, would you like to answer that?
Sure. That was the exceptions that were defined by the state and actually by the legislature when they created this program. So that's part of state law, and it's not something that an individual city can alter. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that, Suzanne?
No, I think that's okay. And maybe you want to continue and answer the question about how is backup power how is backup emergency power generation on-site fuel oil storage treated for large commercial buildings constructed new or renovated in this demonstration program?
Yes, that is a good question. You know, there are a number of buildings in Cambridge that have critical loads that use generators, or diesel backup systems, and that is something that our research consultant is looking into and kind of examining if the model rule already allows for emergency backup to be an exempted use, and if not, you know, if that would be an appropriate exemption for Cambridge to call out.
Thank you. I see another question. Have you calculated the carbon, whoops, it's moving up and down in front of me. Have you calculated the carbon used to fabricate and deliver new equipment and dispose of old equipment and construction materials? As a very low user of energy, I worry that retrofit would use a lot more carbon than I use. For example, I use 5 to 7 therm of gas per month for hot water, heat, laundry, cooking, versus Massachusetts typical of 100 to 125 therms per month. Are you prepared for, whoops, the question just disappeared.
It looks like the rest of it was, are you prepared for the power failures that could happen when folks turn on heat and demand is exceeded?
So this again would only apply to new construction or major renovations. So these are situations where obviously new building materials would be used regardless of this requirement or not. And one of the things that a parallel thing that's happening in Cambridge is that there is now a requirement for all major new construction projects to report on what's called embodied carbon, meaning the amount of energy in the building materials and the processes to produce the materials. And this will take effect later on this year. While initially this doesn't address the amount of energy, it is the plan, and this is part of the Net Zero Action Plan, that as we start understanding how much energy, embodied energy, goes into new buildings or major renovations, that there would start being a requirement over time to reduce that and really projects start using building materials that have as low embodied carbon as possible. Okay. I'm not sure whether it looked like there were more questions, but I will just look at the ones that I see here in front of me. And if anybody feels that when we get to the end, a question that they posed has not been answered, please feel free to repost it. So here's a question: will the Greater Cambridge Energy Project, due to be completed in 2028, provide us with the electricity that we need for this? I understood that Eversource can only build out for permitted projects. Wouldn't this add to that load? So again, I'll sort of try to answer at a higher level. Eversource understands very well the requirements that are being put in place in Cambridge, and right now they're undertaking building a brand new substation in the Kendall Square area that for the foreseeable future will be able to serve all new needs for electricity in the eastern part of the city. They have indicated that they intend to, and based on their projections, also need to make a major upgrade in the Alewife area, and they are starting to plan for that. I think and there have obviously been quite a number of questions that relate to what if the electricity is not available, then how can we have these requirements? And as noted, this is one of the things that is addressed in the building energy use disclosure ordinance by saying, like, if you are seeking to build a fully electric building, and Eversource says we cannot serve you, then you will not be held to the requirements. And that is something that can also be considered as part of this. And I don't see any more questions. I do see a comment which I think is similar to what I just said, that the utility company is understanding well the increased need for electrification. And I should note that that is, of course, not only based on what's happening in Cambridge. The entire state, as Nikhil described earlier in the meeting, has policies to make all buildings fully electric by 2050. So on the same timeline as Cambridge, and so there's pressure overall in the entire state for the utilities to be able to deliver sufficient electricity to ensure that we can meet our climate goals and that buildings can be fully electric by 2050. And that will obviously happen over time as the grid electrical infrastructure expands. So I don't see any more questions, but I will turn it over to Nikhil or Jennifer if there's anything else to add, like in response to the questions we've had.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. I'll just add one comment, which is, it's important to remember that the city is one of the communities that has adopted the specialized stretch code. So any new buildings built in Cambridge are expected to be very highly efficient, built with a lot of insulation, overall sort of high performance exteriors of the buildings. And so, building with all electric systems is expected to be very efficient and sort of, a minimal amount to the building's electrical load, compared to what it would be using, for summers during air conditioning and stuff. So, there's a very strong baseline of energy efficiency underlying the fossil fuel-free program.
Thank you, Nikhil. Anything else from Jennifer or Brad?
I'll just encourage people again. I've linked in the QA a couple of times the survey, and I know we've gotten quite a few responses from you guys even over just the past week. So please feel free to utilize that link and let us know your thoughts via the survey. And if you have any questions or thoughts that you don't think can be captured in the survey, you can always reach out to us. You can reach out to Brad at the email address on your screen, and we're happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you.
And Jen, can I just add, for folks who might need any translation of the materials related to the slides here today, if you go to that same website, there's a link to fill out a language preference, and we can work with some of our colleagues to get translated materials over to you.
And just to add to that, we are seeking as much input as at all possible in this very compressed time frame. So again, please fill out the survey. If you have networks that you would like to share information with, we can, you have the web link here. We can also supply you with flyers. And we have the webinar on the 24th where we expect to cover very similar material for anyone who couldn't attend today. And Brad is here, so please feel free to email him if you're either looking for more information or answers to questions or suggestions for how we can more widely distribute this information to others. And with that, we'd like to thank you very much for attending. It's great to have so many of you here and an opportunity to answer your questions. And that is it for this evening. So thanks again. Bye.